This stitch is the satin stitch. This can be a difficult stitch to get it to look nice. So there's a few secrets that you can do. Right here I'm going to show you how to do a regular satin stitch. You're going to just cover up a space and you're going to go down and up and down and up and down and up until you fill in an entire area. And I am using one strand of embroidery floss. This takes some time, but if you will be patient, the one strand of embroidery floss will make your satin stitch look so much nicer, because then the little threads will lie next to each other. If you use two strands, they'll twist and they cause some separation of the stitches, you know, and so it'll just lay so much nicer if you'll be patient and do lots of stitches with one strand. You don't ever want to stitch an area that's longer than a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch, because then the stitches get too long and they just won't lie nicely. They're just too much length to the stitches, so it really won't work. So if you do have stitches or areas that you need to fill in that are longer than 3/4, you need to split up the area and do it in halves or something. So you can see that as you do the satin stitch, you want to try your best to keep the stitches nice and parallel with each other. And you just take your time and it'll look nice and straight if you just work your best to get the stitches nice and even. If you do get a little bit off, you can straighten it back up by taking a bigger stitch on the opposite side. Just doing a little square right here, but you can do any shape. You can do leaves, you can do circles. It all works quite nicely if you just take your time and do the one strand. So see how that lies nice and straight across there, and the threads are all right next to each other. It works really great. Now if you want your satin stitch to be raised, then you need to do some base work, and that's what these two are. And so I'm going to, this is just 2 strands of embroidery floss that I did a little bit of a satin base stitch. I would come back over now and I would do satin stitch over the top of this base. So then I would go down the opposite way so that the stitches are kind of cross-hatched across there. And the base stitch is always best if you use the same color as what you're going to do your satin stitch with, because then anything that shows through will be a perfect match. So you can see how I'm going back over this with a satin stitch over the top of a base satin stitch. The bottom doesn't have to be nearly as neat as the top, and I used 2 strands on the base, but I'm going to use 1 strand on the top because remember how it'll lay so much nicer. So you would continue doing this to cover up that space. My goodness, I'm having a struggle there. All right, so that's that one. Here's another base up here that I just filled in an area with chain stitch. I used 2 strands of floss, and then when you would come back and satin stitch across this, you'll just go across the shape over and over and over with 1 strand. And satin stitch is a very beautiful stitch, but it does take some patience. And so the tricks that you need to remember are 1 strand of embroidery floss and do lots of little stitches right next to one another. When you're all done, if you want to come and do like an outline stitch or a back stitch around your shape, that also kind of finishes off the edge, and some people like to do that. But this is the satin stitch. Practice it and you'll get great at it.